The race to fill an empty congressional seat in North Texas has moved to a runoff after a special election on Saturday. The race is to fill the late Congressman Ron Wright's seat. He died in February after battling lung cancer and the coronavirus. Wright was the only sitting member of Congress to have died from the virus. More than 20 candidates ran to finish his term. The late Congressman's widow, Susan Wright, took the most votes but failed to get more than 50%. She will face fellow Republican State Congressman Jake Ellzey in the runoff. Joining me now is James Henson. He is the director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. James, thanks for being here. Let's get a little bit deeper into what's happening in Texas, and then let's talk about what this might mean in terms of sort of broader politics. But both of the candidates going into the runoff are Republicans, and they're both Trump supporters. But the former president endorsed just one, Susan Wright. Did that not push her into the pole position in this race?
Well, it sure looks like it helped. Wright and Ellzey were virtually tied in the early voting with about 7,000 votes each. Wright then received nearly 8,000 votes on Election Day. Ellzey had less than 4,000. So it definitely helped her, although I think for a lot of people, this was a very crowded, confusing race. She was the favorite going in. So the Trump endorsement helped.
Let's talk about what this race says about Democrats in Texas. The Democratic contender who came in third place just conceded a little bit earlier. And what does it say about the anti-Trump Republican candidate, Michael Wood?
Well, there was a lot of talk about whether the anti-Trump sort of themes in this race among him and a couple other people were going to get them anywhere, and it didn't. Wood finished far back in the pack. I think the role of Trump in Texas is complicated. I would say that Texas was very Trumpy long before Trump. There's a history of the kind of politics that Donald Trump activated that had a lot of value in Texas long before this. And so we're going to continue to see post-Trump Texas show the effect of Donald Trump's presidency, but look in a lot of ways very familiar to what politics looked like in Texas before Trump. That is a Republican Party where there's a strong contingent of very dedicated, ideologically driven conservatives, and a strong element of traditional cultural politics and some nativism, frankly.
Let's talk about the Democrat a little bit more. Jana Lynn Sanchez, she's previously run for this seat. She came in third place, but still, given how crowded the field was with Republicans, I'm not sure. Give us a read on whether or not that was really a success for Democrats. And then are Democrats looking at any other Texas districts with an eye towards flipping them?
Well, starting with that district, this is a district that has been looking a little bit more Democratic, but still overall was very Republican. The late Congressman Wright won that seat by about 9 points in 2020. This was actually, looked better for Republicans than it has in the past. The 11 Republican candidates split about 62% of the vote. The 10 Democrats combined for about 37%. If you unpack the district, it looks a lot like the rest of Texas looks now and will continue to look. Democrats did much better in urban Tarrant County, the home of Fort Worth, but barely moved the needle at all, barely broke double digits in the two other rural and exurban counties. So, looking forward, we're going to continue to see Democrats try to contest mixed districts like this. But after an initial optimism the Democrats had after 2018, they really got pushed back on their heels again in 2020. Republicans are now going to control the redistricting process and are trying to move through the legislature new voting and election rules that are advantageous to Republicans. And so the Democrats still have a pretty big hill to climb in Texas, despite the demographic trends that we've all heard about.
James, I also want to talk to you about something that is also a national theme, because in the case of this race, it got very dirty. Tell us about the false robocalls about Susan Wright, and is there any indication where they may have come from, and what might be the consequences for whomever was behind these really hateful lies.
Yeah, there were a bunch of really awful robocalls that were circulating in the district. In the final week of the campaign, that were claiming that Susan Wright was somehow responsible for the death of her husband, who, as the lead-in said, died of COVID. Nobody's been able to track down where these robocalls came from. And I think that's part of the gambit when you get involved in kind of dark art politics like this and you're willing to engage them. The gamble is that there are enough ways to hide the funding and the vendor connections that create these calls that by the time you even possibly get to the bottom of it, if you do, the races are over and everybody's moved on.
Has it garnered any additional sympathy for Wright?
Well, it's hard to know that. I think that's a really good question, Lana, because my guess is that given the tenor of the coverage and the fact that this was, as you kind of indicated, really beyond the pale, even for dirty politics in Texas, and this is not new, I think it may well have helped her in the final weeks as well.
All right, James Henson, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Lana. Thanks for having me.